Okay, so now we're going to talk about fluid and electrolytes. So what is the definition of fluid and electrolyte balance? It's the process of regulating the extracellular fluid volume, body fluid osmolality, and plasma concentrations of electrolytes. So we're going to be talking about how we regulate the fluids in different compartments, including the extracellular compartment. We're going to talk about body fluid osmolality, and we're going to talk about plasma concentrations of electrolytes. So our body fluids have several functions. Our body fluids act as a lubricant. They act as a solvent for chemical reactions. Our cells conduct their metabolism within these body fluids. And our body fluids transport several things, including oxygen, nutrients, chemical messengers, and waste products. And body fluids play a role in thermoregulation. So if it was not for our body fluids, we would not have the body temperatures that we have. So if we lose a lot of body fluids, we become hypothermic. So what are body fluids? It's the water within the body and the particles dissolved in it. And we have two major compartments where our body fluid is contained. Inside of our cells, 2/3 of all of our body fluid is inside of our cells if you're an adult. And about 1/3 of all of our body fluid is outside of our cells. The extracellular compartment outside of the cells, there's actually 3 compartments within it. Between the cells, we call that the interstitial compartment. Within our blood vessels, we call that the vascular compartment. And then the transcellular fluid compartment consists of the little bit of water that's within dense connective tissue, within our bones, and in minor compartments such as cerebral spinal fluid. So 2/3 of all of our body fluid is inside of our cell if you're an adult, and outside of and one third of our body fluid is outside the cell. So inside of our cell, we have 40% of all of our body fluids, we said, or 2/3 is within our cells. About 25 liters of fluid. We have about 25 liters of fluid within our cells. So that's the intracellular compartment. The extracellular compartment consists of the interstitial fluid, that's the fluid in between the cells, and the fluid within our blood vessels. In between our cells in the interstitial compartment, we have about 12 liters of fluid, and within our blood vessels, we have about 3 liters of fluid. And so the extracellular compartment consists of the interstitial compartment, so the fluid between the cells, and within our blood vessels. And then there's a small amount in our transcellular fluids that includes our dense connective tissue, bones, and minor compartments, such as cerebral spinal fluid. So, inside of our cells, we have about 25 liters of fluid. That's about 40% of our body weight. And then the extracellular fluid consists of what's in our blood vessels. So we have about 3 liters of plasma in our blood vessels, and we have about 12 liters of fluid in the interstitial space, which is between the cells. So that's about 15 liters of fluid in our extracellular fluid compartment, and that's about 20% of our body weight. The total body water volume is 40 liters. So if you add it up, 25 liters inside of our cell, 12 liters in the interstitial space, and 3 liters in the plasma. If you add that up, that equals 40 liters. So we have about 40 liters of fluid within our body, and that 40 liters of fluid is what constitutes about 60% of our body weight. Now, Each one of those compartments has a different composition of fluids. However, the total particle concentration is going to be equal in each compartment. So this next slide is going to show us that there's different particle concentrations in each compartment, and we're going to talk about what electrolytes and other particles are contained in each compartment. But before we do that, let's draw a picture of what we just talked about. So we said that inside of our cells, intracellular, we have about 2/3 of our body fluids, which is about 25 liters. Yes? And so that would be intracellular, inside of our cells. We said that about we said that about 40% of about 40% of our body weight is within this compartment, and fluid is within this compartment. So about 40% of our body weight. Now we said that in between the cells, we have what's called the interstitial compartment. And we said that in that interstitial compartment, in between the cells, we have about 12 liters of fluid. And we said that that interstitial compartment is part of our extracellular fluid compartment. So the interstitial compartment plus the intravascular compartment plus the transcellular compartment, which is just a little bit of fluid in the dense connective tissue and minor compartments like CSF. So the interstitial compartment plus the intravascular compartment plus the transcellular compartment is our extracellular fluid compartment. Yes, so the interstitial compartment, which is in between the cells, so I'll just write here between cells. So the interstitial compartment, which is in between the cells, we have about 20 liters. In the intravascular compartment, which is our blood vessels, we have about 3 liters. And we have a little bit of fluid in the transcellular compartment. And all of those compartments, all these 3 compartments, is our extracellular fluid compartment. So we said that we have an intravascular compartment. We have about 3 liters of fluid in there, 3 liters of plasma. Yes? And so this extracellular compartment consists of the interstitial between the cells, the intravascular, which has 3 liters about, and the transcellular. And then inside of the cells, we have the intracellular compartment. So the extracellular compartment has a total of 12 liters plus 3 liters, so about 15 liters. And it consists of about 1/3 of our body fluids, and about 20% of our body weight. So 60% of our body weight is water, right? 20% of it is in the extracellular fluid compartment, and 40% is inside of our cells. Now, we said that there's different concentrations of components inside of each of these compartments. So the concentration of the fluids is going to be different for each compartment. So when we look at the next slide, it's going to tell us that inside of our cells, we have a lot of potassium. Potassium is going to be our major intracellular ion. We also have, so we're going to have a lot of potassium. Let me see how we could do this. A lot of potassium. Lots of potassium. We have lots of magnesium. We have lots of phosphates. And we have lots of protein. And the protein is going to be in the form of albumin. So inside of our cell, we have lots of potassium, magnesium, phosphates, and protein. And inside of our cell, we have very little sodium and very little chloride. Little sodium and chloride. Okay. So we have lots inside of our cell. We have lots of potassium, magnesium, phosphates, and protein, and very little sodium and chloride. And in the extracellular fluid, between this intravascular compartment and in this interstitial space, we have lots of sodium, chloride, and bicarbonate. And we have very little magnesium, potassium, and phosphates. So this would be in our extracellular fluid. So in our extracellular fluid compartment, we have lots of sodium and chloride and bicarb, very little magnesium, potassium, and phosphates. Inside of our vascular space, we have lots of protein, so lots of albumin. Outside, in this extracellular compartment, we have very little albumin. Okay, so we like we said in the previous slide that each compartment is going to have a different composition of fluids, but the total particle concentration of each compartment is the same. And what happens is that the fluids are constantly moving in between the compartments. It's not stagnant. It's constantly moving in and out of the different compartments. But we maintain the same particle concentrations, but the composition inside of each compartment is going to be different. So we said that inside of the cells, we have lots of potassium. It's our major intracellular ion. We have magnesium, phosphates, and proteins. We have very little sodium and chloride inside of our cells. In the extracellular fluid, which includes the vascular and interstitial compartments, we have lots of sodium, chloride, and bicarbonate, but very low levels of magnesium, potassium, and phosphates. We said that inside of our blood vessels, we have lots of proteins, and it's usually in the form of albumin. And in the interstitial compartment, we have very little protein. So keep in mind that 1 liter of water equals 1 kilogram. 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. So a 70 kilogram man, if you were to multiply 70 times 60%, that's going to give you a value, if you were to calculate it, of about 42 liters of fluid. So our body has about 40, somewhere between 40 and 42 liters of fluid, depending on our body weight. So a normal adult is about 50 to 60% fluid. Infant is 70 to 80% fluid, right? So an infant has more fluid in their body than an adult. And notice that as we get older, we lose some fluid. An older adult is only between 45 to 55% fluid of body weight. So 2/3 of all that fluid is inside of our cells. Now, we have different concentrations in each of our compartments, particle concentrations in each of our compartments, because of pumps. If it wasn't because of these pumps, then the electrolytes would equalize on both sides. But we have something called a sodium potassium pump that's going to keep the potassium inside the cell and keep the sodium outside the cell. So inside of the cell, we have lots of potassium. We have about 150 millimoles of potassium. But outside the cell, we have very little potassium. We have some, very little, about 4 millimoles. Outside the cell, we have lots of sodium, about 140 millimoles of sodium. But inside the cell, we have very little sodium. We only have about 10 millimoles of sodium. So, like I said, the fluid between the compartments is constantly moving in and out, but we maintain those concentrations because of something called the sodium potassium pump. And that pump requires energy. And we'll talk more about that later. So infants have the highest overall percentage of body water, true or false? And that is true. Yes, we said that babies or infants are about 70 to 80% water. So to recap, about 60% of our total body weight is water. About 40% of our body weight is inside of the cells, and we have about 20% of our body weight outside the cells. The extracellular fluid compartment consists of the interstitial compartment, which is between the cells, and the plasma that's within our blood vessels. So inside of our cell, we have about 2/3 of all of our body fluid, and it's 40% of our body weight. So it's about 25 liters. I have 28 there, but it's about 25 liters. And then we have about 15 liters in the extracellular fluid compartment. The extracellular fluid compartment consists of the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid between the cells, and the fluid in our vascular compartment, which is the fluid in our vascular space. So when we take in fluids by mouth, we call that PO. So that's one way that we can intake fluids, is by going through our mouth. So there's lots of fluids that we drink, like water, and then there's fluid containing foods, right? Some foods contain more water than others. For example, a watermelon has lots of water in it, right? Fruits have lots of water in it. But all foods have a little bit of, most foods have a little bit of water in it. Another way that we intake fluid is that it's absorbed in intracellular, extracellular compartments from the GI tract. And it may also be administered via the IV route. So we can give them fluids via IV, we can give them fluids via gastric tubes, or we can give them tap water enemas. How do we excrete water? Well, through our GI tract. Keep in mind that if you have diarrhea, that fluid excretion is going to be increased. Via the urinary tract, and that's controlled by the antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone system. We lose fluid through our skin when we sweat. We lose a certain amount of fluid every day, even if we don't have any visible sweat. We call that insensible perspiration. And when we breathe, we lose some water every time we breathe. The fluid redistributes, and fluid can be lost through abnormal routes. For example, drains, if we insert drains. So there's certain things that trigger our thirst. We have osmoreceptors that sense the osmolality of the extracellular fluid. What is the osmolality? It's the concentration of the fluid. So if our fluid in the extracellular space is very concentrated, then it's going to tell the osmoreceptors, hey, we need more fluid. You need to drink more. So we have what's called an osmoreceptor that senses the osmolality. The osmolality is a measure of concentration, of body fluid concentration. We also have baroreceptors that sense pressure. So when our blood pressure drops, for example, because we have decreased fluid volume, then our baroreceptors are going to sense that decrease in pressure, and it's going to cause us to trigger our thirst, for us to drink, tell us to drink. When we have dry mucous membranes, that triggers for us to drink. Keep in mind that as we get older, the osmoreceptors may not work as well. And so therefore they may not feel thirsty even though they're dehydrated, right? If you're dehydrated, then your concentration of the extracellular fluid is going to be high. But the osmoreceptors are not going to sense that, and so that thirst may not get triggered. So fluids are constantly moving between our vascular compartment and our interstitial compartment. And one of the reasons why it moves is because of either osmotic pressure or hydrostatic pressure. So our capillaries are permeable, and things can move through them. Fluid is pushed out of our capillaries because of, if we have too much fluid, that's going to increase the pressure and push the fluid out, right? So if we have too much blood within our blood vessels, That's going to push the fluid out because it's going to increase the pressure. It's going to increase the hydrostatic pressure. And we said we have albumin within our blood vessels, and that's going to cause what's called an osmotic gradient. It's going to pull fluid into the blood vessels because of the osmotic pressure. So fluid is constantly being pushed out when our pressure gets high, and then it comes back in because the protein pulls it in, and we call that the osmotic pressure. So fluid distribution between interstitial and intercellular compartments are constantly moving back and forth because those cell membranes are semi-permeable. They're permeable to water, but not electrolytes. And so when there is a difference in particle concentration on one side or the other, water will move to the area of higher concentration in order to equalize the osmolality in the two compartments. And this is a passive transport. It does not require energy. So we know that albumin is an osmotic. It pulls fluid. Sugar, glucose, is an osmotic. It pulls fluid. So in this particular picture, they have sugar in one compartment and just fluid in the other compartment. So because you have more sugar here, it's going to pull fluid from this compartment to this compartment because you have what's called an osmotic gradient. Because you have a high concentration here versus a low concentration here. This is a passive transport. It does not require energy. So one reason why things move from one compartment to another is because of osmosis. So certain things have an osmotic gradient that pull fluid. One of those is sugar, another one of those is albumin, right? So we said we have a lot of albumin in our vascular space. That's going to pull fluid into the vascular space. But then when the pressure gets too high in that vascular space, the hydrostatic pressure is going to move it back out. And when fluid moves because of a higher particle concentration, we call that osmosis. So movement of water from the intracellular fluid compartment to the extracellular fluid compartment is primarily accomplished by active transport. And that is false, right? So active transport requires energy. It is a passive transport. It does not require any energy. It's just that osmotic gradient and the hydrostatic pressure that drives that movement. So some terms that you should be familiar with. Isotonic means the same concentration as normal plasma. So what type of alterations occur when changes in total body water are accompanied by proportional changes in electrolytes? And that would be isotonic, right? So it's the same concentration. So if you lose body water, but you still have the same proportion of electrolytes, we call that an isotonic fluid loss. If the body concentration is still the same, even though you have less of it, that's an isotonic change. So there's two categories of fluid imbalances. There's imbalances of extracellular fluid volume and imbalances of body water concentrations. So in the imbalance of extracellular fluid volume, in other words, an isotonic fluid imbalance, the fluid concentration is normal, but there's just too much or too little fluid. Now, if you have imbalances of body fluid concentrations, you have a water imbalance. So it's a disorder of the concentration of the body fluid rather than the amount of fluid. So another term for an isotonic fluid imbalance is a saline imbalance. If you have abnormal body fluid concentrations, you're usually going to have abnormal serum sodium concentrations. So here the sodium levels are going to be normal. Here the sodium levels are usually going to be abnormal. If you have too little sodium, then you're usually dehydrated. If you have too much sodium, you're dehydrated. If you have too little sodium, then you have fluid overload. So you're going to look at the body fluid concentration, especially of the sodium, to determine if it's a body fluid concentration problem or if it's just a decrease in the amount of water, but the fluid concentration is normal. So you need to know a normal serum sodium level. It's between 135 and 145 milliequivalents per liter. So we said that inside of our cell we have very little sodium, and outside of our cell we have a lot of sodium. And inside of our cell we have a lot of potassium, and outside of our cell we have very little potassium. And that occurs because of the sodium potassium pump that requires energy. It requires ATP. So sodium is moved out of the cell and potassium is pulled into the cell because of this pump. And that's what maintains those concentrations. Now in this extracellular fluid, if we have a serum sodium level that's abnormal, then we have an imbalance of body fluid concentrations. But if we have less body fluid, but this extracellular fluid concentration is between 135 and 145, then we have an extracellular fluid volume imbalance. So in this type of imbalance, the fluid concentration is normal, but there's too little or too much fluid.